Spirituality and Psychism, a Rosicrucian Dilemma by Allan Armstrong. A paper read at the Rosicrucian conference held at Bournemouth University, Dorset, United Kingdom, on Saturday the 8th and Sunday the 9th of May 2010. This paper is entitled Psychism and Spirituality, the Rosicrucian Dilemma. It expresses some of my personal reflections on the work of a Rosicrucian, particularly in the context of the FAMA and Confessio, in which, as I understand it, the distinction between psychism and spirituality is essential to the accomplishment of the great work, by which I mean the spiritual regeneration of the soul, of both the individual and of humanity. All quotations and references are from and to Thomas Vaughan's English translation of the FAMA, published in 1652. My formative years, particularly my pre-teen years, were full of strange and supernatural events. My family could not or would not engage with me when I tried to discuss them, and my friends, being more or less of a similar age, just made a game of it. Consequently, I spent my earliest years trying to make sense of two worlds, both of which were incomprehensible. Some time before I started school, probably at the end of my 4th year, I had become fascinated with the interior of our local Catholic church. My parents had taken me into it at some point, undoubtedly, and because it wasn't very far from home, I often wandered off to spend time inside it. It was always open. The atmosphere inside the church moved me in ways that I did not then understand, but I felt comfortable there, sitting in the silence, enjoying the smell of beeswax and incense, and soaking up an atmosphere I felt I'd known forever. The sense of wonder it inspired in me then has never left me. Indeed, it is with me even now. In my late teens, I began to meet people on the fringes of the esoteric community. Most of them were interested in Eastern religions, Hinduism and Buddhism predominantly. There seemed to be a lot of gurus, swamis, Buddhist monks and the like, which was very exciting, but there were also people interested in what was claimed to be Western mysticism. It was to this area that I was drawn like a moth to the flame, and it was in this area that I consciously began my spiritual journey. Most of the people I encountered then impressed me by their familiarity with arcane knowledge, of astral worlds, incredible spiritual beings, and awesome powers. But it was a world to all intents and purposes close to me, and, inevitably, like others before me, I was compelled to find a way into it and to see for myself. At first, the very idea of astral worlds and highly evolved spiritual beings made my head giddy with the possibility of being able to partake in their mysteries. However, the more I engaged with such esotericism, the more obvious it became that I was engaging in little more than astral tourism. There appeared to be no significant difference between a trip to another country and an astral journey to another world. Furthermore, it seemed to me that communing with the deceased or with superior beings was in principle no different to communing with strangers in this world, by telephone for example. At first this puzzled me, and I spent a long time thinking about it until I realized that I had been taking for granted the notion that the spiritual and the psychic and the ideas they represented were interchangeable. And with this realization arose the question, how close were they really? Are they synonymous, or is there a difference? And if there is a difference, what distinguishes them? This led me to another question, simple but full of implications. What do these terms really mean? As I eventually came to understand it, psychism meant engaging with the supernatural world. It was an understanding supported by my earliest experience and observations, and reinforced by local wisdom. In my youth, mediums were always a big draw. Well, the term psychic and channel came later. People would travel great distances to consult a medium, whose credentials were sufficiently marvellous. Interestingly, as time passed, I noticed that there was a quiet but fierce competition among mediums to be the most interesting and therefore the most popular on the circuit. It It wasn't enough to be gifted with psychic abilities such as clairvoyance. Successful mediums also had to have the right connections in the supernatural world. At the time, it seemed to me that mediums were as nothing unless they were associated with a really special discarnate person such as Mary Magdalene, a Tibetan hidden master, or an Egyptian pharaoh. They attracted big audiences. Alternatively, a highly evolved being from another world or dimension would be a very advantageous connection. In the 1960s, there were few celebrity mediums doing the rounds, but in the 1970s, more and more emerged as psychics or channels claiming to be in communication with beings from a higher state of consciousness. Transcended masters and saints were popular for a while, especially those who had an urgent message for humanity, usually a very negative one, informing us that unless we modified our behavior, we were all doomed, or that civilization was doomed, but the new age would then unfold into a glorious future. I recall attending a lecture in the 1980s given by the great Elizabeth Clare Prophet. She had it on good authority that things were bleak for humanity. She was, after all, according to her own report, in close and frequent communication with Joseph of Arimathea, the angel Gabriel, and the alchemist the Comte de Saint-Germain, to name but a few. For a while she convinced a lot of people to follow her lead. But we are fickle creatures, and fashions change. Thus I noticed in the 1990s that people began channeling or communicating with minor deities, often pagan, or frequently personifying the latest star to emerge, the goddess, in one of her many forms. And so it goes on, many messages, but nothing new. And I wonder what will come next. Astral travelling was, and I suspect always will be, a major attraction. I remember attending a lecture about the astral world. It was delivered in Bristol in the mid-1970s by the well-known occultist Douglas Baker. More than 150 people were present, and the room, a university lecture theatre, was packed. At one stage in the proceedings, the attention of the audience was flagging, and Douglas Baker noticed this. I watched him gather his thoughts and with increased emphasis and conviction state categorically that no individual was free from sexual seduction on the astral planes, and then explained how this was so. Full concentration was resumed immediately. At that time it seemed to me that psychism and spirituality were invariably linked, and that psychic ability was considered by many to be a true sign of spirituality. Many of the books available were either reports of the amazing powers of certain people or primers for developing psychic power, such as clairvoyance, reading auras, healing people, and of course becoming astrally mobile. The ability to commune with beings from other worlds, to travel freely in those worlds, and to analyze souls and predict their future, has ever been, and probably still is, close to many people's hearts. And I have no wish to argue with them about it. But I'm not so sure about the magical arts, particularly casting spells, which is, fundamentally, the manipulation of the environment and those living in it, by magical and other means. This sickness of the soul appears to be far more widespread today than 40 years ago, particularly among neo-pagans. There are ethical issues involved that few seem to consider important or relevant. For example, is there any difference between a successful love potion or spell and date rape? The lack of information leads me to suppose that it is considered to be okay, so long as you don't get found out. However, this wasn't the case in the ancient world, particularly in the Greco-Roman era, where manipulating others through magical means was punishable by death. Another feature of my formative years was the role of esoteric orders and the many and various magicians populating them. In the early 70s, the region I lived in was thick with them, and astral wars were commonplace, much like gang wars today. And although lethal weapons such as firearms were probably not employed, the use of magic was endemic, as was the use of psychological intimidation. Doors and windows were often daubed with magical signs and symbols, and excrement was occasionally found on the doorstep or in the letterbox. I recall an old friend from that time describing how a certain magician had on one occasion threatened him with a nasty end by magical means. My friend's response was, I think, sweetly pragmatic. He informed the said magician that if his comfort was disturbed in any way via magical means, the antagonist could look forward to a good beating and not on the astral. I believe his comfort remains undisturbed to this day. The classic scenario in the world of esoteric orders, although not exclusive to it, was the conflict between beastly black magicians, typically thought to be followers of Aleister Crowley, and members of the OTO, seeking to destroy decent white magicians who were typically exponents of the Golden Dawn and its derivative orders, who inevitably represented the forces of light and goodness. Today, there are many more esoteric orders busily establishing themselves as entities in the world, building magnificent egregores, to re-establish order and rule the world as it should be ruled. The word egregore is an uncommon word that signifies entities or personalities magically created by a group of people for a common purpose. The players change, but like an old soap opera, the play goes on, a phantasmagoric procession, weaving itself through time upon the tapestry of life, leading souls in a never-ending fairy carnival. Whatever the truth may be, it became quite obvious to me that whether in this world or in the astral world, such endeavours, however fantastic, are still a part of duality, and consequently subject to the laws governing space and time and fate, therefore could offer no greater opportunity for spiritual development than any other activity, such as doing household chores, for example. However, in my early years I had no way of knowing if any of it was true, and so, in the beginning, I ran with the crowd, following the carnival. But now, as I approach the end of my 6th decade, I understand that although psychic or supernatural powers are real, they are not of primary importance. On the contrary, using them for vicarious pleasure, to build an empire, or to manipulate others, regardless of their personal inclinations, is at best naive and selfish, and often immoral, if not evil. Eventually I was led to join a small Christian contemplative order, and with the assistance of my teacher, I began to understand that the experience of different worlds, astral or otherwise, count for little. I learned from him that self-knowledge is far more important, and rather than seeking to explore the astral, or learning to read auras, he encouraged me to explore my own being, to distinguish between the discursive nature of that self born of the material world and the permanent reality that is the substrate of our existence. The first, I soon learned, is a creature of duality, driven by desire and forever chasing the phantoms that dance before the mind's eye, be they physical or astral. The second is unity, which is the spiritual presence of God, the substrate of being for all creatures. It was to this polarization of being, a polarization of essence and form, of self and not self, that my attention was directed, and as I later discovered, the FAMA also demonstrates how important this same truth was to the first Rosicrucians, whoever they were.